Chris had always believed that confidence meant speaking louder, faster, stronger. In every meeting, he raised his voice to compete, thinking volume would equal respect. But every time, people looked away, checked their phones, or just nodded politely. Then came the moment that changed everything. It wasn't a big speech, it wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was a single sentence, spoken softly by a man who didn't shout, didn't push, didn't beg to be heard, and suddenly, the entire room listened. What if I told you? Real power doesn't come from how loud you speak, but from how deeply your words land. Today, we're diving into the hidden art of speaking like a leader, how to get people to respect you, follow you, and remember your voice long after the room falls silent. Are you ready to unlock the voice of a true leader? Because Chris was, and everything changed. It was 9:02 a.m. on a Tuesday. Chris stood at the front of the conference room, gripping the edge of the podium like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Slides projected behind him, filled with sharp data, clean charts, well thought out strategy. He had rehearsed this presentation all night. Every word, every transition, every statistic memorized. This was his moment, his chance to finally be taken seriously. But something was wrong. Halfway through his opening sentence, someone across the table yawned, loudly. Another scrolled through their phone. A manager leaned back in his chair, whispered something to the person beside him, and chuckled. Chris's heart started to race. He cleared his throat and spoke louder. Maybe they just couldn't hear him? He repeated the last point, this time more forcefully. He gestured bigger, spoke faster, trying to grab their attention with volume and urgency. But the louder he got, the more invisible he felt. By the time he reached the final slide, only one person was still looking at him. And it wasn't to listen, it was pity. The room clapped, weakly. The kind of polite applause people give at the end of a boring wedding speech. Chris sat down, embarrassed, confused. He knew his ideas were good, so why did it feel like he just shouted into a void? Later that day, as the hallway cleared out, Mr. Daniels approached him. Older, calm, the kind of presence that made people sit up straighter when he entered the room. He looked at Chris for a moment, then said quietly, "If your voice doesn't lead from the inside, people won't follow on the outside." Then he walked away, and Chris just stood there, those words echoing louder than anything he had said that morning. The next morning, Chris arrived early, earlier than usual. He didn't have a meeting, no slides, no agenda, just a coffee and a question lingering in his mind. What did Mr. Daniels mean? If your voice doesn't lead from the inside? Before long, Mr. Daniels stepped into the office. He didn't rush, didn't bark greetings. He walked like someone who knew the floor would wait for him. Chris followed him into the break room, unsure of how to ask what he needed to know, but Mr. Daniels already knew. He turned, looked Chris straight in the eye, and said, "You don't speak like a leader because you don't feel like one." Chris blinked. Mr. Daniels continued, calm and unwavering. Leadership isn't a tone. It's not volume. It's presence. People feel it the moment you walk in, before you say a word. Chris listened. First, Mr. Daniels said, slow down. Breathe. Ground yourself. Look people in the eyes, not like you're asking for approval, but like you already have it. Speak from stillness, from certainty. Own the room before you even open your mouth. That afternoon, Chris didn't try to say anything. He walked into a team check-in and simply sat. No rushing, no nervous fidgeting. He watched, listened, breathed, and something strange happened. People started turning toward him, not because he was speaking, but because he wasn't. They leaned in slightly when he made eye contact. They quieted when he shifted his body forward. Chris didn't say much, but for the first time, it felt like people were actually waiting for him to speak. And that, he realized, was power. Chris had always thought that leadership meant having more to say, but Mr. Daniels thought differently. The next day, they met again, this time in an empty conference room. Mr. Daniels stood in front of the whiteboard, arms crossed. "Say less," he said quietly, "but mean more." Chris raised an eyebrow. "Mean more?" Mr. Daniels nodded. "Your voice isn't just sound, it's a signal. Leaders speak with intention. They don't fill silence with noise, they fill words with weight." Then he handed Chris a short paragraph. Just a simple company update. "Read it," he said. Chris began reading quickly, his usual tone, moving from one sentence to the next without pause. Mr. Daniels stopped him. "Again, but this time, lower your pitch. Slow down. Pause where it matters. Let your words breathe." Chris tried again. This time, he paused after the key points. Let certain phrases land. He dropped his voice slightly, grounding each sentence with calm control. It felt weird about at first, like he was talking too slowly, but something about it also felt powerful. Mr. Daniels gave a small nod. "Now you're not just speaking, you're leading." Later that week, during a team meeting, Chris was asked to give a quick project update. He didn't rush. He didn't over-explain. He said what needed to be said, with clarity, calm, and quiet authority. As he spoke, something subtle happened. The room stilled, heads turned, phones stayed down, and when he finished, people nodded. No one interrupted. No one glazed over. He didn't need to raise his voice, because now his voice carried weight. Something had shifted, not just in how he spoke, but in how people listened. Before we go on, if this video is bringing you value, take a moment to hit the like and subscribe button. Join thousands of others who are serious about growing and making bold moves in life. Your likes, comments, and shares don't just support the channel. They help spread ideas that matter. So if something here resonates with you, let us know below. Thanks for being part of this journey. Now let's get back to it. By now, Chris was beginning to sound different. But Mr. Daniels wasn't done with him yet. They sat down together one afternoon, papers spread across the desk. It was time to tackle Chris's next hurdle. His words. Mr. Daniels pointed to a sentence in one of Chris's emails. "I think we should try to focus on improving the user experience next quarter." He looked up, unimpressed. "Chris," he said, "these are words that fill space, not words that move people." Chris frowned. "What's wrong with it?" Mr. Daniels smiled. "Everything." He grabbed a pen and rewrote the line. "Next quarter, we're going to enhance the user experience, because that's what earns loyalty." He underlined it. Leaders don't tiptoe. They paint pictures. They use words that create vision, not confusion. He continued, teaching Chris the tools. Use vivid language. Don't say "we're behind." Say "we're losing ground." Use analogies. Compare the project to a moving train or a race car in the pit stop. Use repetition. Drive the message home. And above all, stop saying, "I think." Say, "Here's what we're going to do." Chris went back and rewrote his entire pitch deck. Data became stories. Charts became narratives. Hesitation became direction. A week later, in a team strategy session, he presented the revised plan. He didn't talk about numbers. He talked about momentum, about winning, about what next looked like. And as he spoke, the room leaned in, not just to hear, but to follow. He wasn't just updating a team anymore. He was leading one, with words that moved people, not just minds, but motivation. Growth always brings a test, and for Chris, it came on a Wednesday morning, the quarterly meeting. The room was tight, tension thicker than the coffee. Numbers were down, and people were pointing fingers. Chris had just shared his proposal to fix the bottleneck in production when a senior exec cut in sharply. "This isn't a solution, it's guesswork. We need real answers, not soft strategies. A few heads turned. Some waited for Chris to fire back, but he didn't, because he remembered Mr. Daniels' words from just the night before. Control the tone. Control the room. Chris breathed in, sat up straight, and said nothing for a moment. He looked the exec in the eye, not defiantly, but calmly. Then he spoke. I hear your concern, and I agree what we need now is clarity. No defensiveness, no flinch, just direction. He continued. Let's walk through the data again, together. If something doesn't hold up, we'll pivot. If it does, we move forward with confidence. The room was quiet. Not because he was loud, Poimwa, but because he was in control. By the end of the discussion, even the critic nodded. Chris hadn't won the argument. He had won the room. Because he didn't let emotion hijack his message. He had learned that leadership, real leadership, isn't about speaking more. It's about knowing when to speak, how to speak, and why. He didn't overpower his critic. He led him, with clarity, not ego. A few weeks later, Chris found himself on the other side of the table. A new junior associate, nervous, voice shaking, stood at the front of the room, flipping through slides far too fast, eyes darting for approval. Chris had seen this scene before. He'd lived it. The awkward pauses, the rushed delivery, the desperate need to be taken seriously. The room started drifting. Phones came out. Side conversations bubbled up. Chris leaned forward, and when the presenter stumbled mid-sentence, losing her place, her confidence flickering, Chris gently raised his hand, not to criticize, but to guide. He offered a soft smile and said, "Take a breath. We're listening. Just walk us through your idea, one step at a time." The room fell silent. The young woman nodded, centered herself, and began again, this time slower, steadier. And as she spoke, something clicked. Chris watched as the room leaned in, just like they had leaned in for him. Later, as people filed out, she walked up to him and said, "Thank you, I was falling apart." Chris smiled. "You weren't falling apart. You were finding your voice." She looked at him, confused but grateful, and Chris remembered the words Mr. Daniels had once spoken to him. If your voice doesn't lead from the inside, people won't follow on the outside. Now he finally understood. Chris didn't need to raise his voice anymore. He had become the voice people followed, not by command, but by conviction, calm, and clarity. He didn't demand respect, he earned it. So, what changed for Chris? Everything. Not because he became louder, but because he became clearer. He learned that the voice of a leader isn't built on noise. It's built on presence, power, and purpose. And you can do the same. You don't need a title to be heard. You need intention. So if this story changed how you see leadership, even just a little, smash that like button right now. Subscribe for more mind-shifting stories just like this, and tell us in the comments, what's one thing you'll change about how you speak, starting today? Because your voice might be the one someone's waiting to follow. Use it wisely.